Swords are pretty formidable historical weapons, but what about if you could smash them deliberately? Well, you can, and they did. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Here's an extra little video for a Sunday evening for you folks. So, this is a broken sword which I broke very recently. I was asked by the makers to destroy it. I did. The pommel came off, the blade shattered. But you know what? This blade took an awful lot of abuse. I smashed it into a rock, and it was only when I followed a tried and tested formula to break it that it broke really quickly and easily. Now bear in mind that this is modern S5, so-called shock steel. This is a modern alloy steel designed for making tools out of. They didn't have this in the medieval period. They had far more rudimentary and less reliable steel and heat treatment, so their blades were more likely to break than this one. And yet when I followed that tried and tested formula, I snapped it straight away. And for anyone who didn't watch that video yet, the tried and tested formula is simply to create notches in one of the edges and then hit the sword from the other side. And this happens. So why is that useful information? Well, you might want to break a sword. Why might you want to break a sword? Well, your opponent might have a sword and you might have something else. Like what, I hear you cry? Like a mace, for example. And in fact, we know from historical records that sometimes people deliberately used maces against sword blades to attempt to smash and break them. We know this in European context and also Middle Eastern, Persian, for example. So there are many videos, including on my own channel, in fact, over the years, that have talked about the relative merits of a sword versus a mace. Clearly, they can both do slightly different things. They can hit people, which is the same, but they can both have different strengths and weaknesses. But one advantage of the mace is it's essentially indestructible, whereas a sword, especially a historical sword made of historical steel, very much is not indestructible. Now, this doesn't just relate to medieval or Renaissance Europe, but also Japan as well. In fact, it relates to everywhere in the world, anywhere which swords existed, and things designed to break them, or indeed bludgeoning weapons like maces. And in Japan, for example, they had a weapon called the jit, which is essentially like a crowbar. It's an iron bar with a hilt on it of sorts. And this was used by law enforcement, but it was used to defend against sword attacks as a parrying device, but could also break them in exactly the same way as the mace could. And the secret formula to breaking the sword is really quite simple. All you need is one chip or notch on the edge, and then that is a stress riser. That is a point at which the energy that happens after that is focused on that point, spreads, and is more likely to break the blade. Now, in fact, this also has other ramifications, once we know this, for the way that swords are used, because of course you can't avoid getting edge damage on a sword. Even if you tried to parry with the back of the blade or block with the flat, inevitably, even when you're attacking someone, they might parry with their edge, or you might hit their helmet. And in fact, parrying with the edge was in fact pretty much normal in Europe. But regardless of whether you try to avoid it or not, your edges are going to get damaged. So you have to accept that swords are not as robust as things like maces, warhammers and axes. They are more likely to break, especially when made of historical steel. And that's true of whether we're talking about Japan or Renaissance Europe. In fact, in Japan, we even know that certain schools do use their edges defensively. Some use the flat, some use the back of the blades. But fundamentally, any of these things can result in edge damage, either to the back, which is softer, or the edge, which is harder but more brittle. Even on the flats, where the blade's more likely to get bent by absorbing blows there. So no matter which part of the blade you use, it's still liable to getting damaged and potentially breaking. So what lesson can we take away from this? Well, there are a couple of lessons we can take away from this. One is try and preserve your edges as much as possible. If you see that you're going to hit a helmet, pull back on the power. Don't just plow your blade into something like a helmet or a shield rim or a shield boss, or someone's weapon. If they've already got a weapon in place ready to defend, don't just smash down into it as hard as possible, because you're very likely to damage or break potentially your sword. Okay, so try and preserve your edges as much as possible, because even if you do damage your edges, which sometimes is unavoidable, that will act as a stress riser and makes the blade more likely to break. But the second lesson we can take away from this is, if you're not using a sword, if you're using something like a mace or a jit or even a crowbar, try and smash the opponent's blade, because your weapon won't break and theirs will. So I hope that was useful, and until next time, I hope I see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks.